The Last Days of Hitler is a history drawn from an army intelligence report. The author of both the report and the resultant book, Hugh Trevor Roper, was to go on to become one of the foremost historians of his time. But why did the army commission an officer to present a report on the circumstances of Hitler's death? Well, today the concept of a conspiracy theory is common currency, albeit currency entirely devalued since the 2020 pandemic, during which politicians accused anybody pointing out their catastrophic failures of being a, quote, conspiracy theorist. But in 1946 and 47, bona fide conspiracy theories, in the form of false rumours that Hitler had survived the war, were being stoked, refined and propagated throughout the West by Joseph Stalin's Soviet misinformation machine, as a function of that regime's ongoing ideological war against capitalism and capitalist countries. This demoralising narrative was facilitated by the fact that Hitler and his final acolytes had deliberately shrouded their demise in mystery, to the extent that Hitler's body was not then, and never has, been found. British intelligence then saw the task of proving that Hitler was dead as crucial to defensive counter-propaganda. In rising to this challenge, Hugh Trevor Roper produced one of the most widely read history books of the time, an intelligence report that became an academic work that sold as a popular novel and now stands as a literary landmark. It is a testament both to Trevor Roper's industry as an intelligence officer and his integrity as an academic that half a century later the similarly both historically accurate and extremely popular film depicting the horror that came before the capture of the Führer bunker, the much memed Downfall, could add precious little to the extraordinary story he unearthed in the ruins of Berlin immediately upon the occupation of that city by Allied forces. Reading Trevor Roper is a tonic to anyone sick to the back teeth of the pretension, vanity and stupidity of 21st century academia. Quietly incisive, unapologetically critical, unafraid of making club room cracks at terrifying Nazis, anxious to reduce the hysterical political tapestry of the Third Reich to lucid prose, itching, in fact, for the man in the street, the recently demobbed man, to read about and understand the mechanics of the madness he recently risked his life to fight against. Roper provides, in The Last Days of Hitler, a 160-page insight into the final subterranean implosion of German fascism. It is a book that deserves to be ranked alongside Gibbon's Decline and Fall or Churchill's Histories as a permanent achievement of British culture. Hugh Trevor Roper's preface to this book, along with Air Marshal Lord Tedder's foreword, are read at the end, along with the author's appendix to this volume. The Last Days of Hitler by Hugh Trevor Roper. Chapter 1. Hitler and his Court. Now that the new order is past, and the 1,000-year Reich has crumbled in a decade, we are able at last, picking among the still smoking rubble, to discover the truth about that fantastic and tragical episode. It is a chastening as well as an interesting study, for we discover not only the true facts, but the extent of our own errors. If we are to understand the extraordinary tale of Hitler's last days and appreciate the true character of Nazi politics, it is essential that we should first dispose of those errors. We must recognise that Hitler was not a pawn, that the Nazi state was not, in any significant use of the word, totalitarian, and that its leading politicians were not a government, but a court, a court as negligible in its power of ruling, as incalculable in its capacity for intrigue as any Oriental sultanate. Further, we must know the true political significance of the Nazi doctrine, and the extent to which it retained its purity and determined events in these last days, and the nature of Hitler's struggle with the Army General Staff, the one dissident group which he could neither dissolve nor eliminate, and which at one time might have eliminated him. Unless such political facts and relations are understood, the events of April 1945 will be quite incomprehensible, and the labour of collecting and arranging that complicated mass of evidence will have been, in one sense, in vain, for while solving one mystery of fact, it will have added a greater mystery of interpretation. Some of these statements may seem paradoxical. How many people in the past years were unconsciously seduced by Nazi propaganda into believing that Nazi Germany was organised as a totalitarian state, totally integrated, totally mobilised, centrally controlled. Had this been true, Germany might yet have won the war, for its advantages in time, resources and preparation were enormous. But in fact, the totalitarianism of Germany was something quite different from this. Only policy, not administration, was effectively controlled at the centre. Total war to the Nazis did not mean, as it meant to us, and perhaps only to us, a concentration of all effort upon the war, and a corresponding suspension of all irrelevant industry, for in Germany the production of many inessential luxuries was continued. It meant indiscriminate war by all methods and in all elements. In Nazi Germany, neither war production, nor manpower, nor administration, nor intelligence was rationally centralised, and Ribbentrop's protest at Nuremberg that foreign intelligence was not supplied by the Foreign Ministry, but by 30 competing agencies, is substantially true. The structure of German politics and administration, instead of being, as the Nazis claimed, pyramidal and monolithic, was in fact a confusion of private empires, private armies, and private intelligence services. In truth, irresponsible absolutism is incompatible with totalitarian administration, for in the uncertainty of politics, the danger of arbitrary change, and the fear of personal revenge, every man whose position makes him either strong or vulnerable must protect himself against surprise by reserving from the common pool whatever power he has managed to acquire. Thus there is, in the end, no common pool at all. Irresponsibility of the ruler causes irresponsibility of the subject. The conception of the commonwealth no longer exists outside propaganda, and politics becomes the politics of feudal anarchy, which the personal power of an undisputed despot may conceal, but cannot alter. And how wrong many of us were about that despot too, who has often been represented as a tool, but whose personal power was in fact so undisputed that he rode to the end above the chaos he had created and concealed its true nature, even presiding from his grave over the weak and worthless subordinates in the dock at Nuremberg. If this absolutism was unchecked, uncontrolled by any external force, it is vain to suppose that any internal resistance could have corrected it. No man can escape the corruption of absolute power. The inhibitions, the cautions, the introspections which may influence the exercise of power when it is limited by insecurity or competition do not survive those limitations. And in Hitler's last years it will be futile to look for the diplomacy and concessions of his more tentative days, or the reservations and occasional humilities of Mein Kampf. Then there is Nazism itself, the religion of the German Revolution, which underlay and inspired its temporary but spectacular success, and was as important an element in its politics as was Calvinism in earlier convulsions. Many worthy scholars have examined this vast system of bestial Nordic nonsense, analysing its component parts, discovering its remote origins, explaining its significance, and disposing of its errors. But of all the works on that dispiriting subject, the best, the most illuminating, the most valuable, seems to me to have come not from the conscientious scholars, nor from the virtuous victims of the movement, but, since failure is often a better political education than either industry or virtue, from one disappointed Nazi. Hermann Rauschning, an East Prussian magnate, was one of those military aristocrats who joined the movement in its early days, hoping to use it for their own ends, and who, having made their contribution to its success, and been cheated of their reward, saw the final ruin of their class in the purge of 1944. More intelligent than the rest, Rauschning escaped early from the movement, which he could neither control nor stop, and in 2 books exposed with terrible clarity the true significance of the Nazi movement. His motives had not been pure, either in joining or in leaving the party. He was no Democrat, no pacifist, and no martyr, if these are pure professions, and the intellectual clarity he achieved was the clarity not of suffering, but of disillusion. But truth is independent of the stimulus that has provoked its discovery and the conditions that have guided its expression, and to say that Rauschning is no better than his class is an irrelevant criticism of his books. In those books, he demonstrated, as none other has done, the essential nihilism of the Nazi philosophy. This nihilism, the expression of frustration by the existing world, had inspired the Nazi movement in its early days. It was obscured in the days of power by other more positive interests which became parasitical upon it, but in the last days, with which this book is concerned, when all hope and profit had departed, when all rivals had been eliminated or had fled, and the party in undisputed power had nothing positive to offer any more, it was to this nihilism that it returned as its ultimate philosophy and valediction. The voice that issued from the doomed city of Berlin in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945 was the authentic voice of Nazism, purged of all its accessory appeals, its noonday concessions, and welcoming once more the consequences of its original formula: world power or ruin. For by the winter of 1944 the positive alternative of the formula had failed, as all knew, except a few still blinded devotees. That positive alternative was described in general terms as world power or historical greatness. More particularly defined, it meant one thing only: the conquest of Russia, the extermination of the Slavs, and the colonization of the East. This was the real message of Nazism. It is the burden of Mein Kampf. Obscured by the more general terminology of destruction, it rings through the conversations recorded by Rauschning and in Hitler's last written message, composed when the Russians were already at the gates of the Berlin Chancellery. The last and only positive aim which he bequeathed to his people was still the conquest of territory in the East. This Eastern policy was essential to Nazism. All other positive aims, the conquest of France or Britain, were subsidiary and incidental to it. The offence of France was its traditional policy of Eastern alliances, which had enabled it for 3 centuries to intervene in Germany. The offence of Britain was its refusal to be content with a maritime supremacy, its insistent tradition of preventing the domination of Europe by a single continental power. But the offence of Russia was the existence of Russia. As these offences were different, so the German response to each was different, at least until Hitler, in the intoxication of success, abandoned all discrimination and diplomacy. France was to be finished as a great power. It was to be reduced to second-rate status, and thus reduced might survive as a Western Croatia or Slovakia, independent but incapable of a European policy. Britain was to become a purely maritime power. It need not sink to second-rate status. Hitler was always prepared to guarantee the British Empire, but it must never intervene in continental politics again. Thus, the Nazi policy in respect of the West would ensure to Germany freedom to deal unhindered with the fundamental problem of the East. For Russia, there was no such indulgent solution. As Russia's crime was its existence, so its judgment was extermination. The war in the West was a traditional war, a war of diplomatic aims and limited objectives, in which some residue of international convention was regarded. The war in the East was a crusade, a war of ideologies in which all conventions were ignored. It is essential that we remember the basic anti-Russian significance of Nazism. All the general concepts of that terrible creed conceal a particular anti-Russian significance. Racialism means the supremacy of Germans to Slavs. Living space and geopolitics mean the conquest of their territory. The rule of the master race means the enslavement of their surviving population. Crusades require crusaders. And again, it is in the anti-Russian character of Nazism that we find the significance of the SS, the most fanatical, most mystical missionaries of the new gospel. It was they who preached racialism and living space and practiced extermination and enslavement. It was they who emphasized the crusade by organizing Germanic foreigners into anti-Russian legions. They carried Nordic mysticism to lengths which even Hitler ridiculed, and in the end they were prepared to carry on the Eastern Crusade at a price which even Hitler rejected: surrender in the West. It was not Hitler, but Himmler, the high priest of the SS, who expressed the Nordic gospel in its most outrageous form, and it was particularly in respect of Russia that he expressed it. An appreciation of this anti-Russian character of Nazism is not only necessary to the understanding of Nazism itself, it will explain in part the most significant opposition to Hitler inside Germany, the opposition of the Army General Staff. Hitler's struggle with the Army General Staff is one of the most interesting features of Nazi history during the war, for the General Staff was the one centre of opposition which Hitler, though he succeeded in ruining it, was never able to conquer. In 1924, when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, he looked back on the German General Staff as, quote, the mightiest thing the world has ever seen. But once he had attained power, he discovered with disgust that the General Staff was not content to be a mighty instrument of his policy. It had a policy of its own, and just as it had dictated terms to the Kaiser, so it sought to dictate to the Führer. Hitler liquidated the trade unions without a blow. He frightened the middle classes into submission. He bribed the industrialists. He had no trouble from the churches, and the communists, since they had long surrendered their independence, supplied the most easy converts of all. But the army refused to be converted or bribed or frightened, and since Hitler needed it, he could not ignore or liquidate it. Rather, he had to increase it. At one time, in 1934, the army even forced Hitler to crush his own radical wing, and publicly to disown the revolution of destruction. Unable to storm this last citadel, Hitler set out to sap and mine it. By forced resignations and new appointments, he partially succeeded, but only partially. In 1938, at the time of the Munich crisis, the General Staff under Halder decided to remove the demented government. But the sudden news that Chamberlain had accepted the invitation to Munich knocked the weapons from their hands as they were preparing to strike. Hitler's success at Munich was temporarily fatal to the army leaders. They never had any outside support, they represented only themselves, and they were powerless against a dictator who could achieve triumphs such as this. For a time, the opposition of the General Staff became again insignificant. Besides, the policy of the German government for the next 3 years was not inconsistent with their own. The leaders of the German army believed in a policy of limited conquest. They wished Germany to be a great power, capable of supporting an efficient, well-paid and privileged army. Such a position could be achieved by a mere reversal of the events of 1918, in fact a restoration of imperial conditions. Insofar as Hitler was likely to gain for them that external support which they lacked, they were prepared to support him and to connive at some of the incidental vulgarities of his movement. But as practical men, organisers and calculators, not mystics or prophets, they were opposed to any unlimited venture of which they could not foresee or control the consequences. In particular, they were opposed to any conquest which would alter the social structure of Germany and submerge their own privileged but precarious class in a new millenary Nazi Reich. Thus they were consistently opposed to war with Russia. Russia was the traditional ally of the German Junkers, whose prejudices, though swamped in the middle-class officer corps, still dominated the General Staff. The Bolshevik Revolution did not alter this alliance, for they were practical men above mere ideological conceptions, and in fact it was through an agreement with Bolshevik Russia that they had contrived to keep a shadow army in existence during the dark days after Versailles. Thus the interest of the German army leaders was satisfied by the conquest of Poland and France, and in 1940 they would gladly have called a halt and stabilised the position on the basis of their gains. Unfortunately, what had satisfied them had merely inspired the confidence and excited the appetite of Hitler. The imperial frontiers of Germany were to him a contemptible ambition. What was an end to them was only a means to him. In June 1941, flushed with success and intoxicated by the propaganda which hailed him as, quote, the greatest strategic genius of all time, he set out to achieve the fundamental aims of the Nazi movement, the colonization of the East. With the opening of the Russian campaign in 1941, the opposition of the German General Staff began again. Its ultimate achievement was the abortive plot of 20th of July 1944, but it had passed through long underground channels before it broke out in that sudden, spectacular cascade. At first the generals had merely advised and protested. A Russian war was against their political interest, but their political interest no longer mattered. They had launched themselves on the Brown and Nazi current without making sure of its direction, and now they were adrift. It was against their military knowledge too, but that too was brushed aside, for now they were faced by the greatest strategical genius of all time, who, of all things most, resented the suggestion that there were experts who knew more than he. That Russia could resist the German armies seemed to him a ridiculous belief. "You have only to kick the front door," he declared, "and the whole house will tumble down." When the Chief of the Army General Staff produced figures of Russian tank production, Hitler flew into a rage and ordered the technical department which had compiled such defeatist figures to be silenced. So the generals meekly gave in, as the bourgeoisie had given in, as everyone, according to Hitler's philosophy, would ultimately give in before a superior willpower, and the Russian adventure began. It is true, The house did not tumble down at the first kick, but that was explained away. Just as Britain was only apparently unbeaten, so Russia was only apparently standing up. For practical purposes, Hitler announced in October 1941, the war was over. The Russians no longer exist, he would shout at doubting generals, or in a more compromising mood he would explain that the Russian bear was dead, it merely refused to lie down. And to advertise his confidence, he ordered the dissolution of 40 divisions of the army, the return of manpower to industry, and the cessation of armament production, all without reference to the army command. Nevertheless, the generals continued to doubt. In December 1941, Hitler took over the high command of the German army. 9 months later, Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff and by common consent the ablest of the German generals, the only successor in the great tradition of Moltke and Schlieffen, was dismissed. Meanwhile, the OKW, or Combined General Staff, had become a new political directorate of the armed forces, and suitable generals had been exalted within it. The grovelling Keitel, who believed in Hitler's strategical genius, and the industrious Jodl, who applied it. From the Führer's headquarters in deep underground bunkers in Berlin and Rastenburg, the war was directed by somnambulist decisions. The control of the party over the army was complete, and the opposition of the Army General Staff continued underground. The existence of serious opposition to Hitler in the Army General Staff during the years 1941 to 44 has sometimes been doubted, but Hitler never made that error. It was the greatest mortification to his otherwise complacent spirit that the one instrument on which he must always rely was secretly but fundamentally opposed to him. He often said so. Often he declared that in 1941 the generals had lost their nerves, and only his iron will, his military genius, had saved the German armies in that first terrible Russian winter. Often he openly envied and praised the power, the foresight, and the thoroughness of Stalin, who had liquidated his general staff by a wholesale purge before undertaking the risk of war. Often he raged at his own indignant officers, calling them liars and traitors to their faces until, as some believed, resentment drove them to conspiracy. Personal antipathies increased his hatred of the whole class. However shrilly he might protest his strategical genius, however complacently he might listen to the flattering echo of his protestations, he could never convince himself of its universal acceptance. With his inner ear, he always listened for the voice of mockery, and if anyone at court wished to ruin the career of an officer, he had only to whisper in the right quarter that his intended victim had referred to Hitler as the corporal. Nevertheless, though this opposition to the war existed since 1941 and though its leaders were planning the assassination of Hitler from January 1942 onwards, it could not, owing to the unrepresentative character of its leaders, express itself in action until the myth of Hitler's omnipotence had been shaken by defeat. By 1944, that condition seemed to have been fulfilled, but in 1941 the party was triumphant as never before. If 1941 marks the triumph of the party over the army, it also marks a further stage in the change within the government, the change from a cabinet to a court. Absolute power brings its own corruptions, and after the successes of 1940, a marked deterioration became apparent in the characters of all the Nazi leaders. There were also important changes in personnel. The ascendancy of Hitler indeed remained unchallenged within the party till the end, even in the last days of all, when all power to compel or reward, all machinery to enforce his decisions, all hope of success or relief, all glory of achievement had departed. That demonic character, by mere force of personality, and perhaps the habit of control, reigned undisputed over his followers. But if he should die, Who among his eager flatterers could hope to succeed to that vertiginous position? Relations between the various high leaders can only be understood, says the ablest and least corrupted member of the court, if their aspirations are interpreted as a struggle for the succession to Adolf Hitler. The War of the Diadochi started very early behind the scenes. At first, the succession had been vested by a decree of 1st of September 1939 in Göring, who, though politically a coward, was still an able and important functionary. The founder of the Luftwaffe, the architect of the 4-year plan, head of the Hermann Göring Werke, originator of the Gestapo and concentration camps, a man who had assumed responsibility for bloodshed before which even Hitler had quailed. After Göring, the next in succession by the same decree was Rudolf Hess, a harmless, simple-minded crank, unstable in his decisions and absurd in his beliefs. But in 1941, Hess had flown to Scotland on his crack-brained mission, and the question of the succession had to be reconsidered. Albert Speer, who was present at Hitler's chalet at Obersalzberg on the day of Hess's flight, has described how Hitler received the news of his deputy's eccentric gesture. 2 of Hess's adjutants arrived at the chalet and announced that they had a personal letter from Hess to Hitler. One of them was called in and delivered the letter. Standing in the passage, Speer heard the loud voice of the Führer raised in command. Martin Bormann, Hess's indefatigable assistant, who was already beginning to overshadow his nominal chief, was ordered to make immediate telephone connection with the satraps of the court, Goebbels and Ribbentrop, Göring and Himmler, who were all summoned to the presence. Hitler then called Udet, the air ace of the Luftwaffe, and asked whether Hess had any chance of reaching Scotland, flying alone in a twin-engined aircraft without navigational aids. The reply of the Luftwaffe was a categorical negative. Hess, the experts were agreed, would come down in the sea short of his destination. Encouraged by this, there were some who advocated that the whole affair should be hushed up. Hess would perish and no one need ever know, but Hitler was unconvinced. He despised experts, and he knew Hess's ability as a pilot. He'd sometimes remonstrated with him about his indulgence in these dangerous sports. Lest the British should get in first with their version and exploit the propaganda value of the incident, he at once issued a communiqué. Hess's 2 adjutants were arrested, and in 1945 were still in prison, although hitherto, observes the caustic Speer, the custom of punishing the bearers of bad news had been known only in Asiatic countries. When Hess flew to Scotland, he was already a back number in the Führer's entourage, from which he was gradually being ousted by the persistent Bormann. This mole-like creature, who seemed to avoid the glare of daylight and publicity, and to despise the rewards and trimmings, was nevertheless insatiable in his appetite for the reality of power. By his invariable presence he gradually became indispensable to Hitler. By his well-timed insinuations he succeeded, ultimately, in removing all rivals about his master's throne. At first, though private advisor and financial administrator to Hitler, he was nominally responsible to Hess, but his work inevitably drew him into the personal circle of the Führer. Entrusted with the building of the Berghof, Hitler's chalet, and with the purchase of pictures for his collections, he soon found himself among the privileged favourites of the court and lost no time in discarding his former associates. And Hitler, thinking he had found an industrious and reliable servant, did not detect, or at least never distrusted, in this unobtrusive secretary the consuming ambition which thus innocently disguised itself. By 1941, Bormann, now personal secretary to the Führer, had almost replaced Hess in the inner council. He was permanently there, while Hess emerged less and less frequently from embittered seclusion. On the flight of Hesse, Bormann was therefore a powerful candidate for his position as head of the party chancellery. Goering, sensing a rival and personally detesting Bormann, warned Hitler against him, but in vain. A fortnight later, on opening his morning paper, he read that Bormann had been appointed to the vacant post. To the greater position of second in succession to the Führer, he could not yet aspire. By a decree of 29th of June 1941, the succession was vested in Goering alone, and no heir was mentioned. From now on, Goering was Bormann's greatest enemy, his next intended victim in the Byzantine palace politics of Berlin, Berchtesgaden, and the mobile Führer's headquarters. Nevertheless, though Goering still occupied the greatest position in the state under Hitler, the real position bore little correspondence with its formal expression. From 1941 onwards, the corruption of power and the complacency of the Arriviste began to consume and ultimately to obscure the once vigorous abilities of that formidable character until, at the end, he was popularly regarded as a mere voluptuary, a scented Nero, fiddling while Rome burned. For by 1941, Goering had achieved everything that he had ever sought. He was Grand Vizier, he was Reich Marshal, enormously rich and contented. The war, it was agreed, was won. There was no need of further effort, so Goering began to take his ease among his flatterers and neglect his offices. The Luftwaffe failed, the bombers came through, German industry creaked. But Goering came only rarely to Berlin. He was in Karenhall, his vast country palace in the Schorfheide, dressed, says an eyewitness, now like some oriental Maharaja, now in a light blue uniform with a bejewelled baton of pure gold and ivory, now in white silk, like a Doge of Venice, only studded with jewels, with the emblematic stag of St. Hubertus on his head and a swastika of gleaming pearls set between the antlers. There, in scenes of Roman luxury, he feasted and hunted and entertained, and showed his distinguished guests round the architectural and artistic wonders of his house. A study like a medium-sized church, a domed library like the Vatican Library, a desk 26 feet long of mahogany inlaid with bronze swastikas, furnished with 2 big golden Baroque candelabra, and an inkstand all of onyx, and a long ruler of green ivory studded with jewels. Meanwhile, his art gangsters came continually in from Paris and Rome, from Athens and Kiev, and some also from the museums of Germany, with their tribute of jewels and statuary, of old masters and objets d'art, of Gobelin tapestries and altarpieces, of goldsmiths' work and Augsburg work, and old Roman bishops' staves, and the looted museums and gutted palaces of more ancient, famous states. There, for the time, we may leave Goering. For whatever pose he may have been able to strike at Nuremberg, he was in fact, by the end of the war, a totally discredited figure, as will be evident in this narrative. He had taken Hitler at his word, and behaved as if the war was won, and it was not. The Russian bear refused to lie down, the British refused to admit defeat, and soon there were the Americans to consider too. Doubts grew about the Führer's somnambulist strategy. Under defeat in the east, and bombing in the west, and a universal mental perplexity, the brief unity of party, army, and people began to decompose, and other figures rose to prominence in place of the too soon contented Reich Marshal. To resolve the mental doubts, to refute the whispered heresies, the voice of the prophet, Goebbels, was once more raised, after a long silence, for in time of victory, prophets are unnecessary distractions. To prevent heresy from hatching into plots and conspiracies, the power of Himmler began that rapid growth by which it ultimately seemed to overshadow even the authority of Hitler himself. Joseph Goebbels was the intellectual of the Nazi Party, perhaps its only intellectual. Unlike most of the party leaders who sprang with monotonous regularity from Saxony, Bavaria and Austria, he was a West German from the Latin Rhineland, and it was the Latin lucidity of his mind, the un-German suppleness of his argument, which made him so much more successful as a preacher than the froth-blowing nationalists of the South. Essentially, Goebbels was a practical man, a restless, radical character who sought instant and complete results. If he was capable of seeing the truth, he was also capable of despising it. Consequently, he could use it, and since ideas were to him always currency, never objects of value, he could always prove what he wanted. So he persuaded the Germans that their defeats were always victories, that the enemy was only apparently superior, and that new weapons would make all old problems obsolete. Till, in the end, he proved without convincing, and his constructive propaganda became ridiculous and of no effect. I often had occasion to notice, observes Speer, that Goebbels' style was Latin, not Germanic. His propagandist principles were also essentially Latin. For example, it would have been much better if Goebbels had given the people the same watchword as Churchill gave his people: blood, sweat and tears. This was a hard and honest watchword, and it would have suited the German people well. But Goebbels always raised false hopes among the people, which merely caused discrepancy between his propaganda and the trend of popular opinion. In fact, Goebbels' position did not depend solely upon his propaganda. He was respected for his intelligence, his administrative ability, and his apparent personal integrity. He neither believed palpable nonsense, nor performed ludicrous antics, nor exhibited indecent opulence. He wielded no engines of terror or oppression, and he was a radical who preached not only total war, but also total mobilization, which those, like Goering, who prized their privileged standard of living, would never advocate. Nevertheless, propaganda remains his permanent achievement, his ultimate title to fame. Whatever else history may say of Dr. Goebbels, it must credit him with one contribution to the science of politics, a terrible but a positive contribution, which, like the atom bomb, may be deplored, but cannot be undone. He created a system of propaganda, ironically styled public enlightenment, which persuaded a people to believe that black was white. Certainly Hess and Goering and Bormann could claim no achievement comparable with this. On Hitler's side, the sinister figure of Himmler grew daily in stature. In the public imagination, Himmler is a real and terrible figure, a cold-blooded, inhuman ogre, ruthlessly exterminating millions of helpless prisoners by every refinement of sadistic torture. Not a man, but an impersonal abstraction, a creature to whom the weaknesses of pity and forgiveness are unknown, an inexorable monster whose cold, malignant rage no prayers, no human sacrifices can ever for one moment appease. Certainly, Himmler was implacable. His power seemed as unlimited as his ambitions of destruction. In the calmest, most dispassionate manner, he ordered the destruction of whole races, the extermination of Jews and Slavs. He was quite pitiless. Nothing horrified him. The thought of hundreds of thousands of men and women stuffed into, quote, humane gas wagons, incidents which frequently drove the criminal attendants mad. The knowledge that the torture chambers of Europe were peopled by his victims, and that at every hour of the day his name was being execrated by dying people in a whole continent. These things, if he ever thought of them, never interrupted the regularity of his meals, never disturbed the routine of his office, never disconcerted the puffy smoothness of that cold, complacent expression. But Himmler was not a sadist. There was nothing terrible or volcanic in his character. His very coldness was a negative element, not glacial, but bloodless. He did not delight in cruelty. He was indifferent to it, and the scruples of others were to him not contemptible, but unintelligible. "But they are animals, or criminals," he would say, with ingenious deprecation, when foreign ambassadors or even his own subordinates sometimes remonstrated at some particularly savage holocaust. In this monster there were many curious qualities, which have made him to some an incredible, enigmatical figure. He was extraordinarily ignorant and naive. The man who, after such a career, culminating in total defeat, still regarded himself as a fit negotiator to meet the Allied commanders, and hoped to be continued in office by their permission, cannot have been a man of diabolical subtlety. He was also beloved by all of his subordinates, men of neuter conscience indeed, but in other respects apparently of only normal weakness. His adjutants and advisers remained, even after his death, unconditionally loyal to him. No one in the SS conspired against him. To the end, he was its Reichsführer, and its members spoke of him with affection as Reichscheiny. "Brutality?" his subordinates exclaim in naive chorus. There were no signs of brutality in his private nature. Hesitation seemed to them his most obvious characteristic. Himmler himself could never understand the reputation which he had acquired. In the end, he despaired of understanding it. It was some strange foible of foreigners, he concluded, and he satisfied himself with making little jokes about it in his private circle. Nevertheless, the character of Himmler is not as mysterious as these facts may suggest to those familiar with the variety of the human mind. In a civilized world, it is true, such men are seldom tolerated. But if we look back at the cataclysmic periods of society, at periods of revolution and violent social change, his prototype is there. It is the Grand Inquisitor, the mystic in politics, the man who is prepared to sacrifice humanity to an abstract ideal. The Grand Inquisitors of history were not cruel or self-indulgent men. They were often painfully conscientious and austere in their personal lives. They were often scrupulously kind to animals, like Sir Robert Bellarmine, who refused to disturb the fleas in his clothes. Since they could not hope for theological bliss, he said, it would be uncharitable to deny them that carnal refreshment to which alone they could aspire. But for men who, having opportunities of worshipping aright, chose wrong, no remedy was too drastic. So the faggots were piled and lit, and the misbelievers and their books were burnt, and those gentle old bishops went home to sup on white fish and inexpensive vegetables, to feed their cats and canaries, and to meditate on the penitential psalms, while their chaplains sat down in their studies to compose their biographies and explain to posterity the saintly lives, the observances and austerities, the almsgivings and simplicity of these exemplary pastors, knowing, as Cardinal Newman said, that it is better that all humanity should perish in extremist agony than that one single venial sin should be committed. Such a comparison perhaps seems fanciful, but nature is fanciful in designing the human mind, and times of revolution do throw up into positions of eminence men who, in stable periods, remain unobserved in jails and monasteries. Himmler himself, everyone is agreed, was an utterly insignificant man, common, pedantic, and mean. He was careful of money and incapable of thought, and yet he could not resist the temptation to speculate, to lose himself in the O altitudo, and entangle himself in the theological minutiae of the pure Nazi doctrine. Hitler himself, in one sense, was not a Nazi. For the doctrines of Nazism, that great system of Teutonic nonsense, were to him only a weapon of politics. Quote, he criticised and ridiculed the ideology of the SS. Quote. but to Himmler they were, every iota of them, the pure Aryan truth, which if a man keep not pure and undefiled, he shall without doubt perish everlastingly. With such a narrow pedantry, with such black-letter antiquarianism did Himmler study the details of this sad rubbish, that many have supposed, but wrongly, that he had been a schoolmaster. He gave Speer the impression of being, quote, half schoolmaster, half crank. During the war, while Goebbels was demanding total mobilization, Himmler was employing thousands of men and millions of marks in the projects of a religious maniac. In one department of his Foreign Intelligence Service, a school of eager researchers studied such important matters as Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, the symbolism of the suppression of the harp in Ulster, and the occult significance of Gothic pinnacles and top hats at Eton. SS scientific laboratories laboured infelicitously to isolate pure Aryan blood. An explorer was sent to Tibet to discover traces of a pure Germanic race believed to preserve the ancient Nordic mysteries in those unvisited mountains. Throughout Europe, excavators sought for relics of authentic German culture. When the German army prepared hastily to evacuate Naples, Himmler's only demand was that it should not omit to carry with it the tomb of Conradin, the last Hohenstaufen king. Meanwhile, rich businessmen, if they wished to join his exclusive circle of friends, had to buy admission by subscribing perhaps 1 million marks to the Ahnenerbe, a scientific institute that made expensive researches into Aryan origins. Even in April 1945, when the whole Reich was tumbling in ruins, Himmler was contemplating the colonization of the Ukraine with a new religious sect mentioned by his masseur, and in conversation with Count Bernadotte, having just maintained that he was the only sane man left in Germany, interrupted the discussion of war and peace to digress for an hour on runes. He was particularly interested in runes, the epigraphic alphabet of the Northmen of the Dark Ages. Studied with the eye of faith, they might, he believed, yield resemblance to Japanese ideograms, and thus prove the Japanese to be Aryans after all. In such a character, no grain of subtlety is discernible. Himmler was an elementary believer. His fanaticism was not the difficult birth of fear and weakness, nor his hesitation the consequence of doubt. Doubt had not yet nibbled at the infantile serenity of his cosmic acceptances. It was because he could not follow the intellectual processes or the labyrinthine plots of his subordinates that he would not become involved in them. Because he was assured of their ultimate loyalty to him that he did not interfere with what must have seemed, and sometimes certainly were, their treasonable dabblings. For 2 years, this treuer Heinrich, this faithful Heinrich, who really believed that he was unconditionally loyal to Hitler, allowed his favourite adviser to indulge in absurd but serious attempts at peacemaking. He cannot have been altogether ignorant of the plans to substitute himself for his master, but he would neither condemn these activities nor accept their implications. His followers wrung their hands in despair at his interminable vacillation. In fact, he simply turned a blind eye. The true believer can afford to let others speculate, provided their final loyalty is assured. Of course, if Himmler had only been a crank, we should have heard less of him. He was also, in an executive capacity, very efficient, and he had a capacity for choosing useful subordinates. It is true that his personal court contained some strange figures, that he took political advice from his doctor, Gebhardt, that sinister adviser whom many regarded as his evil genius, that, like Hitler and Wallenstein, he was unduly influenced by his astrologer, Wolf, that his masseur, Kirsten, had attained the position which more orthodox believers entrust to a father confessor, and that his relations with Hitler depended on the illiterate jockey, Fegelein. But these were all personal advisers. On a purely executive level, Himmler chose well, as far as it was possible to choose well in a world of illusion. In return, he was well served, followed even to his squalid grave by the devotion of his subordinates. This dual character of Himmler, his impersonal efficiency as an executor and his oceanic credulity as a thinker, is, I believe, the key to his fantastic career. Animated by an unconditional loyalty to Hitler, to whom, as he often protested, he owed everything, and inspiring, as such simple characters do, a similar loyalty among his own followers towards himself, both competent to execute and too unoriginal to conspire, he was, as long as this harmony continued, an ideal chief of police to a revolutionary leader. It is said that soon after his rise to power, Hitler once called, in Munich, on the aged philosopher Oswald Spengler, in order to receive the blessing of that disreputable sage. The reply of the oracle was unusually laconic. "Beware," he said, "of your Praetorian Guards." On 30th of June 1934, Hitler took the necessary precautions. After that, the Praetorian Guard was in the hands of the stupid, devoted, ruthless, efficient, mystical Himmler, and Hitler felt safe. Safe, that is, until the delicate balance of Himmler's personality had been fretted away, and then it was Himmler's unexpected defection that decided Hitler to end the tedious drama. Only if this dual character of Himmler is appreciated can the extraordinary events of April 1945 be understood. From the opening of the Russian campaign, the power of Himmler had continued to rise. For the Russian campaign, while it alienated the regular army, or at least the general staff, was the consummation of the long ambition of the SS. While Hitler and Goering, intoxicated with pride and assurance, cut up the giant cake of European Russia, promising themselves the Volga and the Crimea, Bialystok and Baku, and awarding the unvalued scraps to their Balkan satellites, Himmler was fixing his more mystical eyes on a vaster, remoter horizon. He was demanding an open road to the east, the creation of the German Reich, this way or that, the fetching home of 30 million human beings of our blood, so that during our lifetimes we may be a people of 120 million Germanic souls. The defeat at Stalingrad, which chastened more realistic thinkers, did not affect the transcendental views of Himmler, for facts do not trouble the bigot and the crank, and his practical activity as a policeman became only more necessary than ever. Throughout 1943 and 1944 his power continually grew. Already head of the SS, the armed SS, the secret police and the criminal police in 1943, he became Minister of the Interior, and the entire police system of Germany became united under his command. In 1944 he achieved a further signal triumph. The German Foreign Intelligence Service, or Abwehr, had hitherto been part of the Combined General Staff, but under the negligent rule of Admiral Canaris, an enigmatical figure more interested in anti-Nazi intrigue than his duties. For the first 2 years of the war it had been borne along, a happy parasite, on the success of the German army, and its well-paid agents had been able to enjoy the café and cabaret life of Madrid and Estoril, and to speculate profitably in the black markets of Belgrade and Sofia with an easy conscience. But when the military initiative had passed to the Allies, the party began to expect something more. It expected intelligence which might restore the failing balance of power, and since none came, it began to criticise. Criticism came loudest and most insistent from the SS, whose own foreign intelligence service was already growing in establishment and ambition under the control of Walter Schellenberg. Among the universally parochial minds of the SS, Schellenberg, its youngest general, enjoyed an undeserved reputation. He was credited with understanding foreign affairs. It is true that his notions were a little less extravagant than those of some of his rivals, and the fact that he began to work his passage home as early as 1942 separates him from the crasser intellects of the party. A North German, he was also exempt from the ideological gibberish of the Austrian and Bavarian Nazis. He believed not in force, nor in nonsense, but in subtlety, and he believed that he was subtle. This was perhaps his greatest mistake, for he was in fact a very trivial character, but he made other mistakes too. Like so many of Himmler's subordinates, he believed in Himmler, and aspired to be the good genius of his master, a counter-influence to monsters like Kaltenbrunner and Ohlendorf, and tempters like Gebhardt, who also shared the confidence and perverted the judgment of the Reichsfuhrer. He believed that Himmler alone was capable of purging the administration of its inveterate ignorance and corruption, and of rectifying the disastrous, arrogant foreign policy of Hitler and Ribbentrop. If only Himmler would be guided by him, if only the master of the greatest, most efficient organization in Germany would be directed by the subtlest and best informed intelligence, then, so Schellenberg naively believed, there would be an authority which might yet rival the fatal maniac of Berchtesgaden, and, with a little good fortune and some careful preparation, might yet save Germany by negotiating a compromise peace. Such, as they ultimately developed, were the plans of Schellenberg, the Gestapo officer who in 1941 had taken over the control of Himmler's foreign intelligence service. To achieve them, two things were necessary. Firstly, he must create an intelligence service superior to all rivals in power and efficiency. Secondly, he must build up some capital of goodwill in the Allied camp and among neutral powers, and seek, where possible, to mitigate the odium which clung throughout the world to Himmler's name. These two objects Schellenberg set himself conscientiously to attain. For 2 years he negotiated with Swedish and Swiss friends, arranged the escape of Jews and condemned prisoners of war, and sought to reduce the severity of Himmler's judgments and frustrate the savagery of Kaltenbrunner. As time passed, he became more ambitious, more fanciful than ever. Like Hess, he believed that English public figures would listen to his overtures. He sent emissaries through neutral countries with tales so extravagant that they were dismissed with humiliating ridicule. He even discovered a cracked psychologist who believed that by ingenious psychotherapy he could bring about, quote, the psychological revival of the Christian soul in the German people. What better qualifications could be found for a peace emissary to the devout English? So Schellenberg planned to send the psychologist on a mission to Archbishop Temple. At the same time, he was building up his foreign intelligence service. Like so many Germans, he was an admirer, a despairing admirer, of the British intelligence service, an organisation of which indeed he knew very little, but of which he had evidently read much in those amazing novelettes which filled the reference library of the Gestapo. From these he had learned much about that all-pervasive, incessant engine which, founded by Edward III and perfected by Oliver Cromwell, had secured the otherwise unaccountable success of British diplomacy and politics, and which, operating through the YMCA, the Boy Scout movement, and other dependent organisations, had overthrown dynasties, altered governments, and assassinated inconvenient ministers throughout the world. To create such a universal, totalitarian intelligence service in Germany was the ambitious dream of Schellenberg. The first stage towards it would consist in the liquidation of the existing intelligence service, the Abwehr, and this, after 2 years of competition during which he exploited every error, every failure of his rival, he secured. The Abwehr was well aware of the doom that was prepared for it, but it was helpless. Rotten with corruption, notoriously inefficient, politically suspect, it could do nothing, and the spasmodic efforts of certain conscientious staff officers to achieve some internal reform led only to disillusion and resignation. Meanwhile, Schellenberg's service, if hardly more efficient, enjoyed all the advantages of attack. In February 1944, his bankruptcy demonstrated by a succession of glaring failures, Canaris was dismissed. In May, Himmler took over. The surviving directors of the old firm were summoned to the Kursalon at Salzburg, and there they were met by Himmler with Schellenberg at his side. In a bombastic speech, Himmler outlined his programme. The name Abwehr, he said, was un-German. It implied defence. He was going to create a new, aggressive, totalitarian and pure Aryan intelligence service instead. And then, his imagination warming as he left the tedious details of organisation for the mysterious generalities in which his idealist spirit was at home, he described the events which were about to follow. There was no room for defeatism now, he said. Great things were coming. The Führer was inspired as never before. His statesmanship, skill, and intuitive wisdom were yet to exhibit their masterpiece. He prayed that the infatuated plutocrats of the West might be foolish enough to invade the continent. They would be hurled back and, quote, drowned in the seas of their own blood. Then it would be the turn of the East. Within a year, the Russians were to be chased headlong across the Volga, over the Urals, and into Asia, their barbarian home, whence a Chinese wall, built by Slavonic slave labour, would prevent them from ever returning. A fortnight later, the Western Allies landed in Normandy. 2 months after that occurred the most spectacular political event since 1934, the General's Plot of 20th of July 1944, which showed that the leaders of the German army regarded the war as lost and were at last prepared to break their alliance with the party. Many of the details of the General's Plot are already well known, and its importance cannot be overrated. After long preparation, a small section of the German people had at last taken the initiative. Ignoring or overriding the fumblings and hesitations of more timorous conspirators, it had made a positive, determined, and nearly successful effort to destroy the Nazi regime. That section was the East German aristocracy. Appropriately, it was in their home in East Prussia that the blow was struck. The rulers once of the German army, now only of the General Staff, the colleagues of Rauschning, who had thought it possible to bend the angry spirit of pan-Germanism to their will by accepting the Nazis as junior partners, and who now sought, by this desperate blow, to undo their disastrous error. It was too late. Their error was irreparable. As a class, the Junkers are now gone forever, as obsolete as the mammoth and the mastodon. Nevertheless, the conspiracy had been well planned and was nearly successful. Several times the explosive charge had been sent to Hitler's headquarters and had returned unused through some technical hitch, before Count von Stauffenberg finally introduced it, concealed in a briefcase, into the conference room at Rastenburg. When Hitler had taken his place and the conference had begun, Stauffenberg laid his briefcase against the table leg and made an excuse to slip out of the room. As he crossed the outer compound, he heard the noise of detonation. Then he climbed into his plane, flew to Berlin, and confidently announced the death of Hitler and the successful usurpation of a new government. It was a premature announcement. In the meantime, Providence, as all good Nazis agreed, had intervened. How Hitler escaped is still not quite clear. Either he had moved away from his place in time, or the peculiar construction of the table had diverted the blast from him. When the dust and turmoil of the explosion had subsided, it was clear that the plot had failed. Hitler's eardrums were pierced, his right arm was bruised, his uniform was tattered, and he had fallen, dazed, into the arms of the ever-obsequious Keitel. But while 4 men lay dead or mortally wounded around him, he was alive. Had the conference taken place in the usual concrete bunker instead of a wooden hut, not one of the participants could have survived. Almost every element in the German political situation was affected by the plot of 20th of July. From that time onwards, Hitler knew that the army as an institution was in opposition. He knew that if he won the war, it would be in spite of the generals, not because of them. More and more, from that moment, he surrounded himself with officers from the Navy and the Luftwaffe. The German navy might not have played a conspicuous part in the war, but it was untainted by treachery. The Luftwaffe might not have come up to expectations, but the blame for that belonged not to it, but to Goering. As for the army, the common soldiers were doubtless loyal, and Hitler came more and more to identify himself with them to the exclusion of their officers. If he trusted any generals at all, it was in a few toadies only, in Keitel and Bergdorf. As a class, he regarded them all as traitors, and their treachery was always in his mind and often in his mouth. Whenever an army retreated or a stronghold fell, he cried treachery. Telegrams of hectic recrimination and angry strategic lectures issued ceaselessly from the Führer's headquarters, and the sedulous Bormann screamed treble to his master's base. At his last full-scale conference, Hitler accused the generals to their faces of deceiving him, and in his last written documents, the testaments that were to recommend him to posterity, he could not omit a last sidelong condemnation of the treachery of army officers and the army general staff. Drawing thus away from his generals into the safer company of his intimate admirers, Hitler inevitably hastened the conversion of his headquarters from a war cabinet to an oriental court of flatterers and toadies. How far the process had already gone is clear from eyewitness accounts of the scene shortly after the detonation. That same day, 20th of July, Mussolini, now the puppet ruler of Lombardy, was due to arrive at Rastenburg on a visit to his protector. His train reached the station early in the afternoon, and Hitler, white as a sheet, was there on the platform to receive him. As they left the station, Hitler explained the miracle of his escape only a few hours ago, and arriving at his headquarters, he took his guest to see the scene of the incident. The room was a mass of debris, for the walls had caught fire after the explosion, and the ceiling had fallen in. After wandering through the smoking shambles, they withdrew for a tea party. As so often, it is over the teacups that Hitler is seen in his most outrageous postures. It was 5 o'clock when the tea party began, and the whole court assembled in the Führer's headquarters. Conversation was naturally about the Führer's escape, but it quickly deteriorated into recrimination. Voices were raised in high-pitched and bitter recrimination, and everyone was blamed in turn because the war had not yet been won. Ribbentrop and Dönitz raved against the generals because they had betrayed Germany to England, and the generals raved in reply against Ribbentrop and Dönitz. All this time, Hitler and Mussolini sat quiet and reserved, as if mere spectators of the scene, while Graziani told them of his African adventures. Then, quite suddenly, someone mentioned that other famous plot in Nazi history, the Röhm plot of 30th of June 1934, and the bloody purge which followed it. Immediately Hitler leapt up in a fit of frenzy with foam on his lips and shouted that he would be revenged on all traitors. Providence had just shown him once again, he screamed, that he had been chosen to make world history, and he ranted wildly about terrible punishments for women and children. All of them would be thrown into concentration camps, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. None should be spared who set himself against divine providence. The court fell silent as the Führer raged for a full half hour. The visitors thought he must be mad. "I don't know," said one of them, "why I didn't go over to the Allies there and then." Mussolini looked embarrassed and said nothing. Graziani sought feebly to break the spell by beginning a technical discussion with Keitel, and all the time footmen, dressed in white, circulated with their teapots among the gaping worshippers. The scene was interrupted by a call from Berlin, where order had not yet been restored. Hitler seized the telephone and shouted his orders into the mouthpiece, giving full orders to shoot anyone and everyone. Why hadn't Himmler arrived yet? Then came the portentous statement of the megalomaniac. "I'm beginning to doubt whether the German people is worthy of my great ideals." These words broke the spell of silence. At once the entire court competed to speak, each protesting his loyalty. In grovelling terms, Dönitz sang the praises of the German navy. Goering began a violent quarrel with Ribbentrop and made a pass at him with his field marshal's baton, and the voice of Ribbentrop was heard above the tumult protesting, "I am still a foreign minister, and my name is von Ribbentrop." Only Hitler was silent now. The parts in the comic opera had been reversed, and the prima donna ceased while the chorus discordantly sang. He sat still. In his hand he had a tube of brightly coloured pastilles, which he continually sucked. Only at intervals, like a still spluttering volcano, would he utter some savage phrase, the residue of his unexpended emotion, about blood and providence and concentration camps. This scene, as it is described to us, is perhaps overdrawn, but not improbably. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we have too many accounts of life in that exotic court to doubt the authenticity in its main lines even of this. When a staid German general compared Goering to Elagabalus, he was not exaggerating. In the absolutism, the opulence, and the degeneracy of the Middle Roman Empire we can perhaps find the best parallel to the high noonday of the Nazi Reich. There, in the severe pages of Gibbon, we read of characters apparently wielding gigantic authority who, on closer examination, are found to be the pliant creatures of concubines and catamites, of eunuchs and freedmen. And here, too, we see the elite of the 1,000-year Reich, a set of flatulent clowns, swayed by purely random influences. Even Mussolini was embarrassed, but then Mussolini had, after all, like Goebbels, a Latin mind. He could never be at home among these cavorting Nibelungs. Goebbels, incidentally, was not present at this Mad Hatter's tea party. He was in Berlin, giving orders for the suppression of the revolt. The effect of the general's plot on the career of Himmler was also decisive. It was both personal and political. Personally, the plot achieved a notable success. It brought Himmler to God. In April 1945, he described to a friend this signal conversion. "I know," he said, "that I am generally regarded as a heedless pagan. But in the depths of my heart I am a believer. I believe in God and Providence. In the course of the last year I have learned to believe in miracles again. The Führer's escape on the 20th of July was a miracle, and a second I have experienced in my own life this very spring." The second miracle was the convenient thaw on the river Oder when Himmler commanded an army group there and the Russians were about to break across the ice. Politically, the general's plot marked the beginning of Himmler's decline. To the outer world, indeed, Himmler never seemed so powerful as in the months immediately after the plot, the months when many supposed that he had actually assumed control of the state, Hitler having been either killed by the explosion or imprisoned by the usurper. Certainly after the plot Himmler increased his authority, for the policeman is never so necessary as when a widespread conspiracy has been disclosed. One of his first acts was to complete his victory over the old Army Intelligence Service, whose former chiefs figured largely among the conspirators and had actually supplied their explosive charge from their captured supplies. They had already proved inefficient. Now Himmler could show that they were disloyal. Against Admiral Canaris, the evidence was inconclusive. He disappeared into prison and 9 months later was executed with medieval barbarity. His successor, Colonel Hansen, was executed. Colonel Freitag von Loringhoven, who as head of the sabotage department had supplied the explosive, committed suicide to avoid a more painful end. His predecessor, Colonel Lahausen, and some others, escaped miraculously to tell the tale at Nuremberg and mortify Goering by their survival. But the old intelligence service was merely a department of the old general staff, and the whole general staff was involved or suspected in this extensive conspiracy. In the great blood purge which followed, a purge more drastic even than the purge of 1934, over 50 general staff officers perished, and hundreds lesser figures were inconspicuously removed. General Halder, its now deposed chief, was thrown into a concentration camp on mere suspicion, and for 4 months never saw the light of day. His predecessor, General Beck, the acknowledged leader of almost every group in the conspiracy, was forced to an untidy suicide. His successor, Zeitzler, was dismissed. Stauffenberg and 3 other conspirators were shot at once on the orders of Fromm, who thus sought to conceal his own guilt, but in vain, for he too was hanged. Streupnagel, commanding the armies of occupation in France, who had rashly obeyed the orders of the usurpers and had imprisoned the Gestapo in Paris, shot himself in a wood near Verdun. Misfiring, he only blinded himself and was executed instead. Kluger, the commander in the field, took his own life. Witzleben was executed, so was Feldgiebel. A philosophical general, he followed the best examples and spent his last hours discussing with his adjutant the immortality of the soul. To Rommel, once Hitler's darling general, whose prestige had been deliberately and, as it now seemed, dangerously enhanced by propaganda, Hitler sent General Bergdorf, his most assiduous sycophant, with a revolver and a poison capsule. He was told that if he would commit suicide quietly, there would be no publicity and no reprisals on his family, and he obeyed. One general who was killed soon afterwards was about to receive a state funeral when his complicity was discovered. The plans were changed at once, and he was hustled unattended to a criminal's grave. No wonder Hitler withdrew into a long privacy. No wonder he shrank from the company of his most competent military advisers and listened only to the bombastic amateurs of the SS. He could no longer be sure of the loyalty of any officer. And no wonder Himmler seemed in these months to enjoy an extravagant measure of power. On the days of the plot, he succeeded Fromm as Commander-in-Chief of the Reserve Army. Shortly afterwards, he took over from the armed forces the control of all prisoner-of-war camps. Within a few months, this former sergeant-major was himself in command of an army group, vainly resisting the Russians on the Vistula front. Nevertheless, in spite of these apparent accessions of power, Himmler was in fact in decline. Though the attempt on Hitler's life made him for a moment more necessary than ever, the narrowness of its failure was proof that he too had failed. After all, it had been a very near thing. It was Providence, as Himmler himself agreed, not the police, that had saved Hitler's life. There were even some who maintained that so extensive a conspiracy could not possibly have been developed over so long a period without Himmler's knowledge. It was against nature, or at least against all precedent. Such doubts were not left unexploited by the patient, persistent Bormann. This evil genius of the Führer, this brown eminence sitting in the shadows, as one of the court described him, Hitler's Mephistopheles as he was more generally known, had by now achieved an undisputed supremacy such as had never been previously known in the immediate entourage of his master. Hitherto it had been, or at least it had seemed, Hitler's policy never to allow any of his ministers to attain to any singularity of position in his councils. It seemed always to play off one minister against another, and so himself to hold the balance among them. But now, Martin Bormann, who, like Holstein in the cabinets of the Kaiser, had, quote, realized from the beginning the importance of representing his position as insignificant, quote, had won the reward of his infinite patience. Never away from his master's side, even keeping the same eccentric hours as he, rising at midday and retiring at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, in sole control of the vast machinery of the party, indispensable, indefatigable, and ubiquitous, he was now the sole custodian of Hitler's secrets, the sole channel for his orders, the sole method of approach to that ever more inaccessible presence. During the years of war, every development had strengthened his authority. The Gauleiters were subordinate to him alone. He had increased their subordination and altered their character. The original Gauleiters had been old party hacks who, having thumped their tubs and blown their trumpets obstreperously in the early days of the movement, had been rewarded with these lucrative and not too exacting offices. Bormann had changed that. One by one, the old Gauleiters had gone, and new men had replaced them. Younger, more energetic, more fanatical men who owed everything not to the impersonal party in the days when Bormann was unknown, but to Bormann himself. Throughout the war, the party machine, like the SS, had grown. Like the SS, it had encroached on the functions of the armed forces, especially in matters of administration and supply, fortification and evacuation. Like the SS, it had become more formidable and more indispensable with every defeat of German arms. Observers who watched the parallel development of these twin engines of power wondered what would happen when they began to conflict, when Himmler and Bormann, having absorbed or conquered all independent bodies, at last met face to face. In 1943, when Himmler was made Minister of the Interior, that interesting moment had come. Till then, the relations between the two men had been excellent. Thereafter, sharp conflicts broke out. The slightest attempts by Himmler to exercise authority outside the SS were openly resented by Bormann. In the provinces, several higher SS and police leaders thought they could presume on Himmler's new authority and trespass on the preserves of the Gauleiters. They were quickly undeceived. Bormann immediately reported such cases to Hitler and exploited them to fortify his own position. To our surprise, it is Speer who is speaking. It did not take him long to stalemate Himmler as Minister of the Interior. Such are the advantages of a central position. In the same way, after the plot of 20th of July, Bormann was again quick to exploit the errors or omissions of his rival. While Himmler naively believed, since Goering was plainly out of favour, that he was the obvious heir apparent to the throne, and took every promotion as confirmation of such a certainty, Bormann was in fact seeing to it that he was moving not upwards and towards the centre of power, but outwards and away from it. In the dark days of the last winter of war, Bormann achieved a further triumph. He secured the appointment of Himmler as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Vistula, a new formation fighting a desperate battle against the Russians east of Berlin. Thus Himmler was moved away from Berlin, where he might still attract the favour of Hitler or interfere with the influence of Bormann, and Bormann, remaining safely in possession, indeed monopoly, of the Führer's ear, did not omit to ascribe the irresistible advance of the Red Army to the incompetence, perhaps even treachery, of his rival. Nevertheless, Bormann, though powerful, was not quite alone, not quite omnipotent, at Hitler's headquarters. Firstly, there remained Goebbels. Over all, or perhaps all but one, of Hitler's subordinates, Goebbels enjoyed one indisputable advantage. He was able. Even Bormann recognised that to quarrel with Goebbels might prove fatal, and Goebbels, in his turn, recognised that Bormann had an undeniable vantage post through the regularity of his attendance upon Hitler. Between these two, therefore, though they differed to the end on many matters of policy, there subsisted, to the end, a working agreement. As an intimate personal friend, Goebbels always had direct access to the Führer. Nevertheless, he thought it prudent to conciliate Bormann by using him as an intermediary in inessential matters, and only using his own special position on special occasions. And Bormann, on his side, recognising this concession, did not seek to interfere with the occasional independence of Goebbels. In the last days of all, the actions of Goebbels and Bormann were symbolical of this practical compromise between the two surviving high priests of Nazism. Their advice was different, their ambitions were different, their personal plans were different, but in the decisions of the Führer, and in the mummery of his court, they agreed, and both officiated together at his last pagan sacraments of marriage and funeral before pursuing their separate courses to different fates. The second character whose personality limited the empire of Martin Bormann was Hitler himself. Liberal refugees, theoretical Marxists, despairing reactionaries have pretended, or persuaded themselves, that Hitler was himself only a pawn in a game which not he, but some other politicians or some more cosmic forces were playing. It is a fundamental delusion. Whatever independent forces he may have used, whatever incidental support he may have borrowed, Hitler remained to the end the sole master of the movement which he had himself inspired and founded, and which he was himself by his personal leadership to ruin. Neither Röhm nor Himmler, neither the army nor the Junkers, neither high finance nor heavy industry ever controlled that demonic and disastrous genius. Whatever assistance they may at times have given or received, with whatever hopes or credulities they may have solaced their occasional misgivings, their frequent disappointments. And certainly, whatever ascendancy he may have gained over Goering, Hess and Himmler, Bormann never controlled the uncontrollable will of Hitler, by whose favour alone he held office. His last political advice, to leave Berlin for Obersalzberg in April, was rejected. His dearest wish, to retain power after Hitler's death, was ignored. In 1939, when Sir Neville Henderson suggested to Goering that he might use his influence to alter Hitler's mind, Goering had answered that once the Führer had made up his mind, quote, all the rest of us are no more than the ground under his feet, quote. It was a universal truth, as true of Bormann as of Goering, as true in 1945 as in 1939. Admittedly, says Speer, Bormann was to the end in complete control of all internal affairs, but at any time Hitler could have resumed direct control had he wished. He had always carried out the old principle, divide and rule. There were political groups who were always ready to do away with others. A few critical words from Hitler, and all Bormann's enemies would have jumped at his throat. If Bormann in fact exercised his power to the end, it was not in his own right, but by the sufferance of the formidable dictator whose incredible willpower, whose hypnotic influence compelled even his critics to worship and obey. Was Hitler, as an historic phenomenon, a product of the years after the First World War? Was he a sequel of the Versailles Treaty, the Revolution, and the events that followed? Was he a figure which these events would inevitably have produced? So Albert Speer reflected in the philosophic leisure of the rock-perched fortress in which he was interned. But seeking to answer these questions, he was forced to re-envisage the character of the man whom he held responsible for Germany's downfall, and re-envisaging it, he replied that he was more than this. It is true, without these events, Hitler would never have found the soil on which his activities could bear such rapid and prolific fruit. But the whole demonic figure of the man can never be explained simply as the product of these events. They could just as easily have found expression in a national leader of mediocre stature. For Hitler was one of those inexplicable historical phenomena which emerge at rare intervals among mankind. His person determined the fate of the nation. He alone placed it and kept it upon the path which has led it to this dreadful ending. The nation was spellbound by him, as a people has rarely been in the whole of history. This conception of Hitler as a phoenix, rare in human centuries, a cosmic phenomenon, exempt from ordinary laws, was not universally accepted inside Germany. It was not accepted by the generals, those hard-headed, unmystical military engines. To them, he was never more than a vulgarian of extraordinary power who fell short of their idea of genius. When I was working with him, says Halder, the ablest of that class, I was always looking for signs of genius in him. I tried hard to be honest and impartial, and not to be blinded by my antipathy to the man. I never found genius in him, only the diabolical. But one man accepted it completely, and his acceptance of it was the basis of its success. At long intervals in human history, he wrote, it may occasionally happen that the practical politician and the political philosopher are one. The more intimate the union, the greater his political difficulties. Such a man does not labour to satisfy the demands that are obvious to every Philistine. He reaches out towards ends that are comprehensible only to the few. Therefore, his life is torn between hatred and love. The protest of the present generation, which does not understand him, wrestles with the recognition of posterity, for whom he also works. The author of that description is Hitler himself, and it is a self-portrait. He had written it in prison, long before he had attained the power he contemplated. His own firm belief in his messianic mission was perhaps the most important element in the extraordinary power of his personality, which lasted long after the external reasons for its survival had disappeared, and the acceptance of this myth, even by the intelligent Speer, is the best evidence of its power.